So we mentioned before that the brain has the ability to process 6 different kind of auditory events or perceptions of those. We can determine pitch, the loudness, timbre, duration, the spatial location, and the reverberant environment. All of those probably have developed. Our ability to ascertain those is an important part of our evolutionary benefit. I'm guessing that each of those has an important function for why we have survived today. One of the interesting parts for me as I look at this is that timbre is more and more, perhaps more important than we realize in understanding how we respond to music. So when I'm designing sounds and making compositions, I'm often thinking about timbre more and more than I'm thinking about necessarily pitch or harmony or even rhythms. We tend to focus a lot more on the analysis of music, being on pitch, rhythm, and harmony. But in some ways, I think timbre is more basic to what we perceive aesthetically, because in that timbre is some kind of qualities of sound that have a lot more about our aesthetic responses than perhaps does the scale or the harmony being used. So when we look at timbre, one of the things that has always fascinated me is how every culture has different preferences for different kinds of qualities of noise or roughness to the sound. So if you go to India, if you go to Korea or Japan or the United States or South Africa, there's a different quality of what's called auditory roughness that is preferable to sound. When I talk about auditory roughness, this is a term that has been examined by acoustical engineers really from the 19th century. Helmholtz was the first one to coin this term in acoustics theory in 1885. So to define auditory roughness, we define it as a sound has a lot of roughness if it possesses a lot of high ratio partials, meaning remember the overtone series where we have a 1-to-1 ratio or 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio, that's the lower notes of the overtone series. As you get the higher ratio partials, you're getting farther away from the fundamental. So that's producing a sense in our brains of more dissonance or more auditory roughness. So if you have a lot of partials that are high amplitude in a high ratio relationship, then they're farther away from the fundamental. Another factor of roughness is that there are always amplitude fluctuations in the spectrum. That when you hear a sound, it's not one constant spectrum, that there's a fluctuation to the spectrum so that there are lots of different movement within the quality of sound. That also adds to its roughness quality. Usually in a high degree of auditory roughness, you'll have a lot of pitch instability, where the pitch of the note is not always stable. The more stabilized the pitch, the less rough it's going to be. And then usually there's a great deal of sonic information between pitch centers. So in high auditory roughness, you'll have glissandos between pitches, or you'll have movement between the various pitch centers. So it's not just a pitch going to another pitch with nothing in between. So that's the definition of what we would refer to as auditory roughness. Here are examples of a few of the studies of trying to, how do we calculate how much roughness is in a sound? And you can see that this study has been going on for a long time now. There are some modern systems, and there's one here that by Vasilakis in 2005, which is a web-based program where you can come up with a quantitative analysis that he has defined a set of tools for identifying exactly the amount of roughness in a particular sound. And that's one that I use today. So with that example, let me give you a couple of excerpts to sort of talk about the difference of how we experience timbre and roughness. And when I'm designing sound, I'm very aware that the quality of roughness in a sound will have a lot to do with what type of people perceive it as pleasurable or enjoyable, or whether they perceive it as unpleasurable. So here's an example. This is a very short clip of a piece that probably many of you know, by Jimi Hendrix, who was a rock and roll guitarist. And listen, what we're listening for in this very short excerpt is the quality of his instrument, the timbre of the sound, and think about it in terms of roughness. So in that short excerpt, you get a quality that if you were to do a spectrum analysis of that sound, you would see there's lots of high ratio partials in that sound. The distortion of the guitar is intentional. You want to have that sort of quality of sound which is specific to this genre of music, and part of the power of the music is coming from the roughness of that sound. As a contrast to that, let's listen to, this is the Kronos String Quartet, has recorded that same work, Purple Haze. But they're doing it on Italian violins and very expensive violins, which were designed on a different quality of roughness. But listen to the same excerpt with a string quartet. So even with them trying to add information, they're doing glisses, they're doing sliding, they're doing sul ponticello, they're trying to do anything they can to add roughness to the sound, but it still doesn't have the power of energy of that distortion guitar. It's not, the pitches are the same, the rhythms are the same, the harmonies are the same, but what's different is the timbre. And in that timbre you find a different kind of auditory reference, which to me is probably the essence of where the sound quality perception is being determined by. So another thing that's interested me is trying to understand how do different cultures develop certain preferences, so that when you're composing sound and you're designing sound, being aware of where the particular culture or group of people that's going to be listening to or who you're designing it for is an important quality. So let's take a look at some examples here. This is a shot of a Japanese no drama, which is an important art form of the 14th century of Japan. And you'll see the stage in No is designed where there's one actor, the main actor, the shite, has a mask that he wears, and there's a chanting that goes on in that shite. Behind the shite you see there's a male sort of small orchestra of 4 musicians. There are 3 drummers and a flute player, a no-kan flute player. Interesting about them is that they are making sounds vocally. The drummers are making vocal sounds that are very rough in their quality to outline the rhythmic designation. The flute player is playing pitches which have nothing to do with the relationship to what the pitches of the shite are chanting on. On the side of the stage you see the jutai, which is the male chorus. The male chorus here again is singing pitches and in a pitch system that has nothing to do with the flute or with the main chanter. So what you have is different pitch spaces. You have all this roughness being added to the sound. So let's listen quickly to it. So when you try to analyze this music, it really doesn't help you much to try to figure out what is the scale, where are the harmonies, even the rhythm doesn't tell you much about what's going on, because the response to this really has to do with much more of the auditory roughness that is built into the technique of playing these instruments. And there's instability in the pitch, there's microtones, there's sliding between pitches. It's all about auditory roughness is where the music is. When we look at a spectrum analysis of that, you can then start to see all that information there. And the spectrum analysis, this is a stereo file, and it's a timeline on the horizontal axis, and then the vertical axis is the frequency spectrum, and then the coloring is referring to the amplitude. So the lighter the color on this one, then we get a higher amplitude on that. And you can see how those drum sounds were having very complex spectrum, almost white noise, because there's every frequency present. And then you can start to see how much amplitude there is in those, each frequency. It's a very rough kind of quality of sound because there's lots of high ratio partial content there. It's hard to find any kind of stability of pitch in the spectrum analysis of that. Here's another example from Korea. This is an art form called pansori, and pansori is a really wonderful epic tradition where you have one singer, or singer, narrator, speaker, who tells one of the primary stories from the pansori repertoire, and there are 5 or 6 kind of major stories that are being told. This narrator, speaker, will tell this story, improvising the story, and there is just one drummer, a puk drummer, sitting on the side of the stage who basically gives some just rhythmic information to help guide along the telling of the narrative. But this story will last 5 hours. And the training for this voice style is that you want to develop a very rough kind of quality to the sound, because it's the roughness that gives the drama to the story. And it's not just the story that is telling, but you listen to the quality of this voice, and this is a very specific kind of quality.
실자난선 구천원이 실제학금 높이더라 절대마도 동가르도 가방은 꼭.
So in that you can hear the entire technique of singing is about instability, it's about roughness of timbre of spectrum. There's lots of shaking of the pitch of wide vibratos, sliding between notes, falling off. This is all improvised, but this is how you tell the story, is you embed tremendous amounts of roughness to the timbre of quality. But there's a power that comes from that is very interesting to watch. And then here again, when you look at the spectrum analysis of that, you start to see the same thing. Very much high ratio of partial content, very little preference for the fundamental pitch in that, which would be more around the sine wave. So the spectrum analysis of this can really show you exactly what is the power of that music is coming from its roughness. Now to contrast that, so let's take a look at a different kind of music. This is a French composer of the Baroque period, Francois Couperin, and this is a piece that was written actually for monastery, for monks, for nuns to be singing originally. But listen to the different quality of this particular kind of music. Almost the opposite to what we just heard, meaning that the desire from this is to reduce the high partial content of the voice, to make a sound of the voice which is focused on really low partial content. There's no vibrato, there's very exact pitch, there's no instability, you move from pitch to pitch, there's no sliding in between. Everything about it is to create a kind of a stability of sound, and you can almost feel the emotional reaction of this. It's not about heavy drama. It's really about relaxation and serenity. And here again, it's a very religious piece that is trying to create a very contemplative feeling. So how we as sound designers work with timbre and try to use the correct timbre, and that's why all of these devices that we're learning about how to manipulate effects of the sound is important, because once you understand the kind of emotional content that you're trying to create with a piece, the timbre and how you design the timbre is perhaps, to me, the most important part of that design. Here again, comparing the spectral analysis of that last piece, you start to see all of the content is in the low frequencies, and there's almost nothing in the higher partials, which just confirms what we were just hearing in that. So that there's a clear desire on the composer to create a very different kind of musical experience on that. So a couple of examples of pieces that I've worked with. This is a work which was taking a poem and setting it, and what I did with this, the reader of this poem, which is a Yeats poem, The Magi, and what she's reading is I took her voice and I ran it through what's called a granular synthesis patch. So it starts to break her sound up a little bit. So she starts to sound otherworldly, like the Magi were considered sort of otherworldly as the sort of shamanistic thinkers. So listen to sort of what I was trying to do to make this, just the reading of this voice, turn into something which sounds very different than a human narrative.
Their ancient faces like pain-eaten stones, and all their helms of silver hovering side by side, and all their eyes still fixed, hoping to find once more. Being chaos, turbulence, unsatisfied, the uncontrollable mystery of the
So that was just a simple reading where a lot of times you couldn't understand the words, but you could tell that there were words being spoken in that. So it's this, to me, interesting way that you can take the computer and blend between something that sounds spoken and something that sounds instrumental, where you don't really understand the words. This was done with a system called Kima, which we'll be talking a little bit later. Another excerpt. This is an excerpt from an opera that I composed a couple of years ago called Ophelia's Gaze. And this is a work where, here again, the reader, I'm extracting the spectrum coming off the voice. That spectrum is then being sustained into other kind of instrumental sounds that are carried on after the reader finishes speaking. So everything you're hearing in the instrumental part of this is being derived from the vocal spectrum that I'm then extracting that information and developing the next section.
And then nothing but the light I see behind my shut eyes.
So in that, it's just a very quick excerpt, but here again is taking the human quality of the timbre of the voice and the phonetics of the words and transferring that into then the instrumental sounds so that everything about the instrumental piece is being derived from the human voice.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.